Well, the government finally stopped meddling with social media. Now, the Supreme Court has agreed to consider whether the Biden administration's efforts to curb online, quote-unquote, misinformation during COVID and on other subjects was unconstitutional. Last week, the court stopped a preliminary injunction aimed at preventing federal officials from potentially unconstitutionally interfering with content moderation decisions by social media platforms. Now, while agreeing to decide the merits of the case, this case being Murphy v. Missouri, it used to be called Missouri v. Biden, it began with a lawsuit by the attorneys general of Missouri to Louisiana and was joined by multiple social media users who claimed that their posts were downgraded or deleted because of pressure from the federal government on the social media platforms.
Now, at this time, the Biden administration remains free to resume contacts with social media companies.
So there was a preliminary injunction with the local judge, Judge Dowdy, agreeing with the argument that the censored accounts were making, that it was improper, the level of contact the federal government had with them, and he made a list of behaviors that are no longer permissible and that are permissible, and we discussed that and whether that was actually workable distinctions. Then the Biden administration appealed. They said, no, we want to be able to pressure companies to censor if we so choose. That doesn't violate the First Amendment. They appealed. It went to the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit narrowed it gave a little bit more power back to the federal government to have contact, but did not invalidate the underlying ruling. Again, an appeal. Now the Supreme Court is saying that for the time being, the federal government can totally resume the contact with social media companies, but we're going to look at the issue. So now the Supreme Court will be taking on this case, and you can tell from the fact that Justices Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch, they thought the ban on the federal government should actually stay in place while they considered that. I would think that's probably 3 votes to endorse the underlying idea that it was improper. I would suspect you're going to end up with more votes eventually, possibly even some liberal people. I mean, this is not really a partisan issue.
No, and it is interesting that the injunction was lifted while they're deciding this decision, which I think militates in the opposite direction of the 3 votes that you just pointed to. I mean, look, this is never, the timing of this could not be more salient to what's going on in the public right now. As we covered in earlier in the show, you have reporting that Anthony Blinken has reached out to try to change the content that Al Jazeera, one of the only news orgs that is doing live streams and really consistent coverage from the ground in Gaza, puts out because it believes its reporting is too sympathetic to Gazans and too sympathetic to Palestinians. They so far have not tried to influence Al Jazeera English. I'm not sure if it's because potentially it would be implicated by a decision like this, but the fact that they are already trying to lean on the main Arabic, Al Jazeera, I think speaks volumes. And if we are heading into a wartime setting, a wartime footing, we have to take the lessons of the post 9/11 era and not make ourselves vulnerable as a country to the kind of infringements on speech and personal liberties that we allowed after 9/11 to horrible effect, I would argue. Not just TSA, which I know is a personal bugaboo of yours.
I flew back here yesterday and got a very heavy pat down, as I so often do.
But
what fun.
I mean, we have seen, many stories we've covered, whether it's Israel's Instagram account targeting American Palestinian, I'm afraid of his Bella Gigi Hadid, but one of the Hadid sisters, whether or not it's the IDF, former Israeli figure who was so close with Netanyahu, was tweeting the information about the bomb blast, that the hospital bombing that caused so much confusion on the internet, taking credit for it before denying credit for it. Its social media accounts have been working on overtime, I think, because they do understand that public opinion is shifting in these really interesting ways right now, largely because of the on-camera footage that is coming out of Gaza that didn't used to exist in years obviously before social media. And I think we can read into efforts to push back against the various narratives, whichever side you agree with an understanding about how important public perception is. And the U.S. government having any authority on managing that public perception in these discrete undisclosed ways is a huge issue. It's a huge issue.
We can't overstate how important this case is going to be for the government's ability to pressure independent media organizations, to pressure anyone to sculpt the narrative in a way that the federal government thinks is favorable to itself. I think that violates the First Amendment, but we're going to find out whether it walks some line. This is the Supreme Court technically says, well, because obviously the federal government couldn't pass a law, couldn't order, can't actually order Facebook to take down content, can't actually order a media company to not publish something or to censor something. They couldn't pass a law to do it. They couldn't order them to do it. So the question is, can they say, we would really like you to take this thing down. We think it's very harmful. It's dangerous. It's hateful. We think it violates your policies, actually. We think it's misinformation. We think it's of illegitimate or fraudulent origin. And, we might be publishing a report next week on how your organization doesn't take these threats seriously, and we'll probably be talking to other media outlets about how you failed on this front. And there's going to be a hearing in a month on how your organization and organizations like you have failed, and that we might be revisiting the regulations that affect you based on your failure to respond to our inquiry in a prompt and favorable way. Yeah. Does that violate the First Amendment? We're going to find out.
And look what happened with Russiagate. Even floating to these organizations that a certain kind of policy choice might help Russia. You should be looking out for Russian disinformation. Even seeding the field in that way caused kind of technically independent decisions to be made within Twitter that were ultimately reversed and regretted. So given the high temperature of the conversation here, where so many people have already been fired from their jobs, dismissed from media organizations, had their students being threatened on college campuses, professors writing, "Don't hire my law students because they're anti-Semites," because they've vocalized a support of Palestinians. I do think this is just the tip of the iceberg, and that's what's happening kind of on an individual basis on a fairly regional level. I'm really concerned about what this could end up manifesting into. And I do think all eyes really should be on the outcome of the Supreme Court decision. Yeah,
we will, of course, be covering that as it takes shape, and I'm hoping to see that a number of other justices perhaps privately share the concerns that Thomas and Alito and Gorsuch clearly do, and that so many of us do on both on the right and on the left, that just the power for the federal government to shape the discourse in this way is used for ill, is inappropriate, and violates the spirit of our free speech protections, and then possibly, I'm hoping, does literally violate the actual tenets of the First Amendment.
Yeah, because they're going to say this is in our national security interest to suppress pro-Hamas speech.
Yeah,
that's going to be the line.
Just like they said it was in public health interest to suppress alleged misinformation about COVID mitigation strategies.
A national security interest to suppress Russian disinformation.
Russian bots that weren't even Russian bots, that were just actually American people. They were convinced they were Russian bots. They were told by the social media companies, no, those are real people, and they didn't care. Yeah. More Rising right after this.